Hello everyone, and today we're welcoming back Thomas Peaple for another talk on ancient history, this time about the historian Herodotus. Now, I must warn you, not everything in Herodotus's account is family friendly. We've tried to make it as suitable for viewers as possible whilst getting the points across, but that said, it's probably one of those things where you may want to double check the video before showing it to your children. And welcome back to the programme.
Hello.
So, why is Herodotus called the father of history when his work is predated by historical accounts such as the Annals in China?
Well, I think we should remember that when Cicero called him the father of history, he may not have known about things like the Annals from China. Unfortunately, partly due to the fact that the Romans did seem to think of themselves and possibly the Greeks as more important than anybody else, but partly the genuine problem of the lack of transport. I mean, nowadays, there were books published in America. I could go on Amazon and find out it exists even before it's published in the UK. If I really wanted, I could even buy it in America and just accept an extra postage fee. Those days that wouldn't be possible. You probably wouldn't even know what existed, even somewhere relatively close like China and Greece or Rome. So I think, in fairness to Cicero, he may have simply been unaware of those earlier works due to the Greco-Roman world he lived in.
But even in the Greco-Roman world, there were accounts of past events such as Homer's Iliad, were there not?
Well, I can't presume to know the mind of Cicero, but the best guess I can make is that things like Homer may have been seen as what we might call historical fiction. I say that because whilst, as far as we can tell, most Greeks considered the Trojan War itself a historical event, plenty of other accounts contradict or disagree with things in Homer. So they may well have seen Homer as having a basis in historical events, but nonetheless writing primarily to write nice poetry, and therefore not interested in what we might call history for history's sake. For that reason, it's quite likely Cicero saw Herodotus as the father of history, in that he was the first, in Cicero's eyes, to be writing history for the sake of writing history rather than using historical events as a backdrop to primarily write beautiful poetry. But again, that is only a guess because I can't advise it.
So, why are later people credited with creating the historical method?
Largely because if Herodotus were writing today, he would not be accepted as a historian. Well, he's certainly not if he wrote the way he did. What I mean by that is he rarely even tells us who his sources are, and even rarer does he comment or evaluate or discern between them. That does occasionally happen. So, for example, he dismisses an account that Cyrus was suckled by a female dog. I think we all know what that's called, but I won't say it here in case it offends YouTube rules. But a female dog. And he insists that this was a misunderstanding. There's an account of a battle where he says this is supposed to have happened, however the people involved deny it, and other witnesses give account in their favour. But that's rare. Most of the time he just gives us his narrative flow without mentioning who his sources are, certainly not saying, I've looked at this source and I've chosen to believe this source because, or I consider this source more likely because. It is all written like a narrative with no comment at all on his sources, which, given that there are events in Herodotus' book that he almost certainly didn't live through or was very young at the time of, and in fact some accounts such as his account of the history of Egypt in book 2 could probably have not involved any eyewitnesses. He couldn't have even met eyewitnesses, let alone been one. So, given that we know he was dealing with things where he had to have been using something that wasn't an eyewitness themselves, although in theory he could have read eyewitness accounts, but he certainly couldn't have met eyewitnesses. It's very unhelpful historically that he never tells us who he's getting his information from, or what he's getting his information, or if it happened to be some written thing. In addition, there are times when we have good reason to believe Herodotus is making stuff up, at least in particulars. So, for example, before the Battle of Marathon, the generals decide when to fight, the votes are tied 5-5, and one of the Miltiades go to someone else to get a casting vote. And when he comes to the guy, he starts telling him He says to the other man, your job is this, therefore, blah, blah, blah. But it would basically be like walking up to a football referee and saying, you're the referee, you decide whether a goal stands, you get to decide whether to issue a red card. And I know that's not strictly true since VAR, but you get the idea. It's sort of information that would have been irrelevant to say in the circumstances, but Herodotus would probably need it to explain to his audience what the relevance of this conversation is. And I think Herodotus often may be doing that. So, I mean, in addition, the whole conversation is between two men who Herodotus couldn't have spoken to because one of them died in the Battle of Marathon and one died a year later. And it's possible, but not likely, that there was a minute of this conversation because it's supposed to be a secret meeting. So there really is no way on earth Herodotus could know the dialogue, and as I mentioned above, he's clearly imagining some of it. So, and yet he never says, I'm imagining. For example, Thucydides, a slightly later historian, would say, now, at this point I don't know what they said, I wasn't there, but I'm imagining it was something like this. Herodotus makes no acknowledgement of this, it's just, he just writes it as if he was there and recorded it all on a tape recorder, which we know he couldn't have done. So yes, there are a lot of problems with Herodotus' historical method that nowadays would probably mean his PhD wouldn't even be accepted without significant revision.
Given the limitations, why do we rely so much on Herodotus?
Well, it is partly that he has the good fortune of the lack of alternatives, but the other thing that's going on is that sometimes we have been able to corroborate or compare him to other sources. Now, this doesn't always go in his favour. For example, he claims there was a Persian fleet of 1,207 ships. Very unusually specific number, but Aeschylus Persian says 1,000 ships, 207 were special fast ships. So it's likely he misheard or misunderstood, and therefore the 207 ships is a mistake. But there are other times where we get the opposite. For example, we found something called the Byzantine inscription, which mentioned 7 conspirators who supposedly killed a particular king of Persia. And Herodotus gives those 7 names as well. 6 of them, excepting slight discrepancies in spelling, which you would expect at a time when spelling was much less uniform than it was today, are the same. So 6 out of 7 of the names Herodotus gives them to us are corroborated. Now this is a minor detail, given that most of them play no further part in the narrative, and yet 6 of them are the same in Herodotus and a completely separate source. To take another example, Herodotus gives the story of the rise of Cyrus the Great, and he claims that the king Astyages, apologies if that's a mispronunciation, wants Cyrus killed as a baby. He asks one of his noblemen to kill Cyrus. The nobleman disobeys, Cyrus survives, and years later he takes vengeance on the nobleman Astyages takes vengeance on the nobleman by tricking him into eating his son. He kills the guy's son, invites the man to dinner, gives him a nice meal, and when it's finished and he's saying what a lovely meal it was, he reveals the truth and says, you've just eaten your son. And according to Herodotus, years later he takes vengeance on the king by leading a mutiny that helps Cyrus win. Now, obviously there's a lot of problems with this account. First of all, why would a king put someone he knew had such a grievance against him in charge of an important military mission that could end his kingship? Total arrogance, possibly. That does happen, but it does seem a bit strange. Also, for the mutiny to work, the nobleman has to persuade a lot of other soldiers to also revolt. That's the only way the mutiny can succeed in its goal. So, were they all really angry about what the king did to his son? Possibly, but it's one thing for one person to spend years stewing and angry and eventually rise up. For that many people to keep their revenge like that for so many years seems less likely. So you'd think that if they were all that angry about it, they'd have deposed him at the time, not given him years more to rule and possibly do the same thing loads of other times. And if it wasn't, and only Harpagus was doing it for revenge, what was the motive of all the people he persuaded to revolt? So it's easy to dismiss this as folklore. However, we have found another source that corroborates a mutiny occurred. Granted, it doesn't say why there was a mutiny, but it does agree with Herodotus that a mutiny occurred, which suggests that even this more fanciful tale from Herodotus does have corroboration from another source to at least have some basis in reality. So it's a combination of lack of alternatives and the fact that when we find them, some of them do actually give Herodotus some credence.
So, what was Herodotus's main topic?
In theory, it was the Persian Wars between Greece and Persia, but as Herodotus is well known for, he has a habit of digressing. So he starts by saying he's going to explain the story of the rise of the fight between Greece and Persia, but in background to this he starts by doing things like telling us the story of Cratius, now best remembered for the expression rich as Cratius. So he tells the downfall of Cratius and then tells us the story of the man who deposed Cratius, i.e. Cyrus, hence the story of Cyrus. And this goes on and on throughout the book, where he'll say, so for example, at one point he's talking about an attack on Samos, and he says, Corinth agreed because on a previous occasion, when a group of boys were sent from the island of Corcyra to be punished physically, and I mean more than whipping, I mean a form of dismemberment, but I will ask viewers to check the specifics for themselves by reading Herodotus if they wish. But basically some kind of brutal punishment, and basically the people of Samos stopped, because basically they took refuge in a temple, and when the Corinthians tried to starve them out, the people of Samos danced near them and accidentally let them grab food from them, so eventually the Corinthians gave up. But then Herodotus has to explain why the Corinthians wanted to do that to the Corsyrans, and again he can't just quickly say it was in vengeance for the death of Lycophron, son of the tyrant of Corinth. He has to explain why Lycophron was in Corcyra in the first place and gives a very long account of it. So, although in theory he's telling the story of the Persian Wars, he regularly goes into digressions as he leads up to them.
Would you say that he focused on kings?
How much kings is more debatable, because after all, things like Athens, the democracy, were a key player in the narrative. But I certainly would say he was an exponent of great person history. I've already mentioned how apparently Cyrus became king as an act of vengeance by a nobleman against his previous king. Among other things, he claims that the Ionian revolt started for two reasons. One, because one man basically had been brought to the palace of Persia, and when he arrived it became clear to him that he was never going to be allowed to leave. So in order to go home he sent a note to his fellow Ionians and said, start a revolt so they'll let me go home. And the other person who agreed to start it did it because he'd just got in trouble over he'd basically done a military mission that had gone wrong and he thought he was going to be in trouble, so he started a revolt. So these two personal reasons start a war. Now obviously, given that a war once started over the outcome of a football match, it's not impossible. But it does show there's a pattern in Herodotus of everything being about personal vendetta, personal anger between individuals, little or no consideration for wider possibilities that could have also affected events. So, kings maybe, maybe not. Great person history, absolutely yes.
Is it possible that he had sources which have now been lost?
Highly probable, but because, as you just said, they're lost, we can't find out, we can't check, we can't cross-reference. We can only assume that it's most likely he had sources that are now lost, because, as I say, there are times when he certainly couldn't have been speaking to eyewitnesses, so there must have been some other records whether oral or written.
So, should Herodotus be the father of history?
No, because as you mentioned, there are earlier writers in history who deserve true credit as well. I would be sceptical of calling anyone the father of history because probably it would be a bit like the law code. Hammurabi's code was found and he was proclaimed as the first lawgiver until archaeology found something older, and then that person was given the credit for a while and something older was found. So I'd be very sceptical of going, oh yes, this man in China, he's the true father of history, because it may only be a matter of time before we dig up something else that proves something even older. But yes, there were the historians in Herodotus, and Herodotus was not an historian in the modern sense. That said, the number of little stories in his histories do make fascinating reading as long as you take them with a big pinch of salt.
Thank you again for joining us today, and hope you have a pleasant day going forward.
Thank you.
Thank you again, Tom, for joining us today, and thank you for watching, and however you enjoyed that episode, whether you a fan of Herodotus or not, it was lovely having you here.